Hello, it's Ashley Berner. I'm an associate professor and the director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy. Welcome to Hopkins at Home. Thank you for joining us. It's a real privilege to work at Johns Hopkins. We have at our institute the privilege of working with federal and state and local policymakers and with schools of all different types across the country. So the focus of our conversation today is where we are in education and why other models of public education are really interesting and perhaps something we could learn from. So my first question for us today is this: what's public education? Those of us who were raised in the United States tend to picture immediately public education is the district school, the neighborhood traditional district school. That's what public education has meant in our country for 100 years. And yet, here's what's really interesting. If you had a camcorder back in the old days and you went to the Netherlands and you asked people on the street, what's public education? They might answer any of 36 different kinds of schools: Jewish schools, Catholic schools, socialist schools, Montessori schools, district schools, because the Netherlands funds 36 different kinds of schools on equal footing. There's a very different notion of public education in the Netherlands. Well, the Netherlands is not alone. I did my doctoral degree at Oxford, and my children attended a school that was, in our country, would have been considered private, but it was funded by the state. England has multiple models of schools that they fund on equal footing. Australia, Sweden, Belgium, most provinces of Canada, Indonesia, Hong Kong. Well, we don't know what will happen in Hong Kong, but up until recently, Hong Kong funded many different kinds of schools and held all of them accountable for academic results. So that's the difference between educational pluralism and educational uniformity. So I just want to take a minute and walk through these different terms because we're going to be playing these off of one another. Educational pluralism is a different way to structure public education such that the government funds all kinds of schools on equal footing, but they don't necessarily operate those schools, yet they hold them accountable for academic results. Most democracies are educationally plural. The United States is what's known as a uniform system. There are some nuances to that, so hold that for a moment, but our systems, our state education systems, are designed to have one deliverer, which is the district school. The district model is oftentimes, even in state constitutions, called a uniform school system. Some constitutions have this, state constitutions have this built in. So we're looking at a very different way to construe public education. There's uniformity and pluralism. Now, one very critical distinction is that a uniform system in which only the district is the carrier of public education, it means that any departure from that norm has to justify itself. It has to justify itself in terms of better test scores or, better school cultures, better long-term outcomes. And there's a lot of antipathy between different, what we call in education, school sectors. So you will hear district leaders talking about other forms like charter schools as taking money from districts. You'll hear charter schools and private school choice mechanisms at odds with each other. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but the point is here, educationally plural countries don't pit these kinds of schools against one another. They don't say in terms of policy, are Catholic schools better with outcomes? Are district schools better with outcomes? Rather, they help all schools get better. So there's some very interesting things right away. So I want to talk for a minute about pluralism because it is a bit of a different notion than we have in this country. What does it mean and how is it justified democratically? So the first premise is really about philosophy. And educational pluralism is justified in democratic terms by saying it's not possible for schooling to be neutral with respect to values. So we should fund schools with very distinctive ethos. Now, let me just say a little bit about this. This is not primarily a religious argument. This argument is about the fact that it's really difficult. You can't consider a human institution that doesn't make some kind of philosophical value judgments. And this is true of all human institutions, and it's also true of schooling. So, for example, what does a school's disciplinary policy look like? What does a school's hiring policy look like? What does the curriculum look like? These are chosen. And so the first premise is because they're all chosen, we should make sure that schools are variable. We should fund a variety of different institutions. And in some countries like the UK, this matter of a distinctive ethos is really, really important. Schools have to talk on their websites and in the interview process and so forth. How are we different from others? This is what distinguishes us. So that's the first premise. The second premise is really an equity premise, which is this. Well-resourced families have lots of options. In our country, well-resourced families can enroll their child in a private school at their own expense, or they can move and buy a house in a high property tax area that will roll the money over to education in that area. They can buy their way into school choice, as it were. And the premise here with equity is that every child and family have different needs and different sensibilities about what they need pedagogically or in terms of values and so forth. And we have to make sure that we're letting all kids make those choices, not only wealthy choices, not only wealthy families. So that's an equity point. The third premise I want to take a minute on, because this is really about political philosophy. So when we talk about democratic society, there are in education policy, there are three entities. On the one hand, there's the state, the government. On the other, there's the individual or the individual family. And we have voices in our country on both sides of this pole, where one group says only the state can legitimately deliver democratic education. And there's a libertarian pole on the opposite side that says education is primarily an individual good. And so this is the consequence would be give families the money and let them choose which school they want, and that it's purely an individual matter. Well, educational pluralism says no, it's in the middle. Education can't belong to either the state or the individual exclusively. It needs to belong to that area that political scientists call civil society, the voluntary organizations. And when we look at the plural educational systems, that's exactly what happens. The government will fund a variety of schools, sometimes deliver those schools, sometimes provide the education, but not always. So this is a civil society argument. I can go very much deeper on any of these points if you want to in the Q&A. The fourth premise is really about civic formation and democracy. And this, I think, for me is very, very important. Those of you who are not in education policy, hang in here with us because this has great bearing. So the premise of pluralism is that unlike other choices that we make as free Americans. Unlike making a choice to buy a car or making a choice to buy a pair of jeans, schooling cannot be just an individual's choice, because all of us are affected and implicated and somewhat responsible for the civic formation of the next generation. It matters to me that your child knows how to read and knows the branches of government. It matters to you that my kids, if I have kids, but if I didn't, that other children, it matters to you that they know where the Ukraine is, for example, or they know where the Middle Eastern countries are. This matters for the democratic perpetuation of a free society. So therefore, this is a very important therefore, democracies have to ensure academic excellence on behalf of all the schools that they fund. In education policy, this is sometimes called accountability, but this is what keeps educational pluralism from being purely libertarian. It's about all of us, and therefore the state must ensure that there are no, quote, failing schools. Most democracies have something in place to create a common curriculum or a common or common assessments. So the Netherlands, back to my favorite example, the Netherlands funds 36 different kinds of schools, from secular to district to Orthodox Jewish to Montessori. But all those kids have to take a common assessment, the same content, to make sure that there's a democratic conversation that's viable. It's very hard for me to give this talk without breaking for questions, because I'd like to have the back and forth, but we'll have half an hour for Q&A. And then the final premise is that educational pluralism, when it's well designed, can have positive impact for young people. Now, if it's well designed really matters. It has to do with incentivizing distinctiveness on the part of schools and holding them all accountable for academic results. And if it's absent that, then all bets are off. But when it's well designed, that educational pluralism can benefit kids. Now, I just want to stop and pause. And if we were having a seminar, I would say, what questions, what's come up here? So save your questions, but please know that I want to know what you're thinking and what your response is so far. So the question is, going back to this difference, where educational pluralism is a mosaic of schools, and educational uniformity has legitimacy only to the district school, which is changing a bit. But here's the question: why is the United States an outlier among democracies? Now, I didn't know any of this before I went off to graduate school in other countries and saw how different their school systems were. In our country, we tend to think there's public and there's private. Those of us who are involved in education policy or in states with charters would say there's private, public, and charter schools. But by and large, we have this very rigid definition of public education. So to find out that we were outliers was a real surprise to me. So my doctorate's in history, and I started studying the history of our experience. So why does the US have a uniform system? So here's the interesting thing. We used to be educationally plural. In the early days of the Republic, the states, mostly then the counties and the cities, funded schools that reflected the demography of those in the cities. And this often because Americans were more religiously observant back then. There were sometimes non-sectarian schools, but there were often Catholic schools, Baptist schools, Congregationalist schools that were funded from the taxes levied on the local population. And Horace Mann, who was the first Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, said, wait, this is a really bad idea. We are going to be splintered across all different kinds of groups and siloed. We need one common school. And in fact, in towns where there was not a large population, there was usually a common school. This was not unusual. It tended to be a common Protestant school, more on that later. But in general, Horace Mann's arguments were actually fell on deaf ears. It was seen having a one model, the common school model is another, what we would call today a district school. Having one model was seen as oppressive of value sensibilities, minorities in particular, and also of local control. So it didn't look like the United States was going to become uniform. We were plural, like most democracies. However, something happened in the middle of the 19th century that changed the equation. And that was the influx of millions of Catholic immigrants to our country. And some Catholics were fine. They could get funding for their schooling. But when places like Boston had almost 50% of their population Catholic, and even some of the New England states, and even all the way out into the West as the movement was heading westward, so many Catholics threatened the Anglo-Saxon white Protestant majority. Now, this was a full-blown culture war of the 19th century. And what we saw between the mid-century and just after the Civil War are political parties that took on Catholic education and said, we cannot fund Catholic schools. The code word for that was sectarian schools. It was a cry that was taken up by political parties, first the Know Nothing Party, and then the post-Civil War Republican Party, built no funding for Catholic schools or for sectarian schools as part of their party platform. In the meantime, nativist movements like the Ku Klux Klan adapted this anti-Catholicism, anti-Judaism, very, very much a Protestant movement, firebombed Catholic neighborhoods. I mean, it's hard to convey how big of a deal this was in the political life and cultural life of the United States in the 19th century, but suffice it to say that by the end of the 19th century, every state had some kind of regulation against sectarian schools. These are the notorious Blaine Amendments for those of you who follow constitutional law. And so we had the beginnings of the district model. Now, ironically, the same legislatures that voted to defund sectarian or Catholic schools voted to require Protestant prayers and the Protestant Bible read in the district schools. So my mother went through public school in the 50s. She graduated from high school in 1960. They said Protestant prayers. The Supreme Court, I think appropriately, secularized the district schools starting in 1960 because they were normative, they were religious, and they shouldn't be religious. But the point is this: they felt neutral to the Protestant majority. If you were Catholic, if you were atheist, if you were Jewish, if you were Jehovah's Witness, the big bad boys of the early litigation were Catholics and Jehovah's Witnesses, you did not feel that this was neutral. So that's a very long way of saying that's how we got to a uniform system. It has been in place for more than 100 years. That's our expectation. And it isn't just a matter of law, it's a matter of our cultural backdrop. That's why the first question I asked you, what does public education mean? Is our default is a certain, we go off and running. That's our default in this country, by and large. Now, there are people who've experienced education differently, but that is by far the majority of Americans' experience. So I have to say, those of you who do follow education, we know the landscape of education has been changing. There are, for 30 years, there's been something called a charter school. The map right there shows you the gray are states that have some kind of charter law where charters are permitted. The green are the very few states that have no charters allowed. Now, a charter school is not a private school. It's a public school that receives money from the state and sometimes the local government, but always the state and the federal government. it is not operated by the district. They are operated independently. And about 7% of American students now attend charter schools. That's hugely variable. Washington, D.C., 50% of the kids attend charter schools. In places like Boston, huge, in New York City, a lot of kids attend charter schools. And in those states, the charter schools are excellent. There is variability because the quality of the charter schools depends on state law. I'm happy to unpack that. But there are charter schools. There is also something called a private school scholarship. This is often when you hear the term choice. School choice will say either a voucher in which state funds go to low-income families. Usually it's low-income families to take the money to go and attend an accredited private school. And that's been upheld by the federal constitution. The permissibility of vouchers, it depends on state law. One mechanism for want of a better word, choice is the tax credit scholarship, which allows individuals and corporations to make a donation against their tax liability to support scholarships for low-income kids to attend private schools. Now, Florida has, I think, 200,000 kids on tax credits, but in the aggregate, there are fewer than 1% of Americans who use these funds. Now, so that's about 8% of kids in the United States who are accessing these options with the help of the state. Well-off families can make those choices anyway. Now, but I think the point I want to make, though, is even though these are pushing against the norm of uniformity, they're still contested. There is not one new law that is not litigated, sometimes all the way up to the Supreme Court. So, you know, this is highly contested at the moment. And the consequences, as I said earlier, is that we have leaders on all sides who are diminishing and demeaning the very good work that goes on in district schools and charter schools and Catholic schools and Jewish schools. It's very dispiriting, and that part of it is not normal around the world. I even education research is contested for some of these political and cultural reasons. So that's the general backdrop. Everything I've said to you up till now would have been true 2 years ago. This is a long-standing tension in American education policy, but there are certainly some changes in the last 2 years that I want to note that have taken us to a bit of a different moment. And part of it is because of COVID. As you know, so many schools have been shut down. And things now are at a very interesting inflection point that have some benefits and also some real risks. So I want to spend the last 5 minutes talking about those potential opportunities and some real risks in education policy. So there is certainly intense frustration among parents, in particular, parents of young children, about the learning conditions. You've read about this, you've seen it, it's heartbreaking, the learning loss that so many young people are facing. There's also a lot of conflict about masks. You have probably seen the intense polarization over curriculum, as what happened in Virginia, for example. There are a lot of debates about critical race theory, other things. This gentleman in North Carolina was a parent who spoke at a board meeting, went viral. This was a week and a half ago, saying, we want you to focus on academics, not these other things. And there's just a lot of contestation at the same time because of COVID and because of the curriculum issues. There has been a growth of non-district schooling. The charter sector, which had been going down in terms of enrollment, blossomed. Charter schools are expanding. Homeschooling. As many kids are homeschooled now as are in charter schools. It's 7+ percentage of the population. Now that may be temporary, but in places like New York City, homeschooling has doubled. The fastest growing sector of homeschooling parents are African American parents. And that's been true for 5 years. But But this little chart, which is too small to see, shows you the growth of homeschooling and other models in this current context. So these things can be mostly beneficial to those of us who really do believe in the expansion of more options as long as they're done well. But there are certain risks, and the first risk I want to raise right here is that some of the voices arguing for an expansion of non-district choices are against accountability or the public assurance of quality. And these are the kinds of slogans that you will hear if you listen in on these debates. The government regulations are bad. Parents know best. Let 1,000 flowers bloom and personalized learning. There's a very strong anti-government emphasis here that I think we have to watch out for, because there's no evidence that when the state takes its hands off and says, parent enrollment can determine quality and the school will close down if it's not good. This seems to me an abrogation of the policy responsibility. And the second risk is around this notion of exposure versus indoctrination. I am actually writing about this quite a lot right now. That's probably the title of my next book, is about exposure and indoctrination. But there are those who would see school choice, as it were, as a means of protectionism, of getting away from contrary viewpoints. And actually, that's not good, I believe, for democratic formation. It is really important that there is a common baseline of knowledge and content that all children need to know to engage in the democratic world. So those are, very, very concerning to me and to others. So we're at a very interesting inflection point. And I think our institute's certainly watching a lot of this with trepidation. So what I would say is that would be very interesting is taking a lesson from the UK or the Netherlands or Canada or Australia. What if we had a bigger and better framework that simply said all schools matter, all families matter, and academic excellence is a democratic necessity? I just want to pause for a minute around this notion of academic excellence. This is a huge issue in our country for reasons that have nothing to do with pluralism versus uniformity. There's been an anti-knowledge bias in our country in the educational systems that we're so glad to see is finally turning around. I can talk about that. Our institute spends a lot of time looking at academic excellence, what it is, how do you know? We work with districts across the country, but that's also got to be in the mix. And what if our states could fund a wide variety of school types equally and ensure that all of them were excellent? That would be, more akin to what our democratic peers undergo and experience. And that's the subject of our conversation today. So you have been very patient in listening to my overview. I know there must be lots of questions. I'm really glad. I wish I could see you. I hope you'll be free to write me afterwards. I've seen questions come up. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so here's the first question. How is educational pluralism different from school choice? Okay, that's a really good point. So I wrote a whole book on educational pluralism without using the term school choice. There are two reasons for that. First of all, in our country, the term school choice, however well-intentioned, is often aligned with a libertarian anti-accountability voice, and also this sense that is pro-market. I mean, I'm pro-market in economics, but not in education. And this notion that competition and the free market are the way to grow a good education system. So that's the first reason. It can be associated with a lot of things that I think maybe are misdirected. The other reason is because school choice, think about the term. It's actually reinforcing this notion that we don't usually have a choice. Asking for school choice is basically asking for an exception to the norm of uniformity. Whereas my friends in the UK don't think about school choice because it's built in by design. So there's some rhetorical reasons as well. So I'd say that's the big difference. If people use the term school choice, that's fine by me. I don't use it, but I would always want to say that the quality assurance has to be there. And that's what's so admirable about the high quality charter schools, the charter laws, where there's a barrier to entry into the educational market, and a barrier is very high. Okay, hope that answered the question. The second question, the US couldn't have pluralism because we have separation of church and state. Okay, that's a really good question. The separation of church and state, those of you who follow constitutional law know that term is not in our Constitution, but it's a doctrine that was developed actually hand in hand with the Supreme Court's judgments on schooling. So the theory there is the United States federal Constitution does not allow an establishment of a religion. The question is, does funding schools that are not secular, funding a religious school, does that constitute establishing a religion? And the Supreme Court has been very clear on this. It is allowable. The educational pluralism is legitimate. It is constitutional at the federal level, as long as the funding is not state funding that goes directly to a school. The funding has to be allocated by the legislature to the families, and usually, again, it's low-income families. Those low-income families then can make a decision of which school they want to go to. It may be that they're secular, maybe that they're religious, but as long as you have those checks and balances, it's legitimate from a federal perspective. So pluralism is potentially constitutional. It has been declared constitutional by the federal, according to federal protocols. State constitutions differ. Vouchers, which is sort of the mechanism, is a state budgetary line, goes to low-income families to enroll in the whatever schools they want. That's actually legitimate in some states constitutionally, but not in others. Tax credits, because the funding is never in the public coffers, are always constitutional. At least there hasn't been the Supreme Court has not struck it down. Tax credits. So it's a complicated but very, very, very good question. Short answer, yeah, it is. Educational pluralism is legitimate, even though religious schools might get funded in the end, as long as the mechanisms are constitutionally appropriate. Okay, the next question: how do pluralistic school systems keep from being overregulated? Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really, really difficult question. I think that the fear that many libertarians have is that private schools would be overrun by state regulations. And there I would simply say it's a matter of the regulation being about the important things and not just about compliance. So the important things are, is this school safe? All of those requirements. But is this school delivering strong instruction? And interestingly, back to the Supreme Court has validated the right of the state to ensure, even when schools aren't being funded, even when private schools are not funded by the state, it matters to the state. So there is some appropriate oversight anyway. And I can give some examples of that. But the best way to keep from being overregulated would be, first of all, the district schools are overregulated right now. Any district administrator would tell you that they spend a lot of time on compliance issues instead of the heart of the instructional core. And that's a shame. And it's the same with bureaucracies everywhere. Every single piece of it may have an appropriate rationale, but sum total is just a labyrinth. So pluralistic systems that work well try to leave the school ethos alone so that the school can pursue its ends as long as those ends are not nefarious in some way. And we can talk about those guardrails, but they usually have the best pluralistic systems have a very lean, tight inspections, site visit, for want of a better word, inspections, where they actually have trained administrators who visit the schools, look at the test scores, interview the parents, and it's like a whole school picture of how the school's doing. They usually conduct these every 5 years unless there's a problem, in which case they have more stringent reviews more frequently. I think that's the key. There have been a couple of cases internationally where the state has stepped too far over the ethos of the schools, and the schools usually win. I can give examples of those if anyone wants. But that's a really good question. How do you find that balance? One tiny story on that. The UK has had something in place called Ofsted, which is their inspectorate. It's considered one of the best in the world. And for a while, the Ofsted inspectors were actually, the schools protested that there was just an overly burdened regulatory regime. And so the Ministry of Education pulled them back and said, we'll keep it simpler, because the last thing you want to do is impair a school, even while you're making sure it's good. Here's the next question. How can we balance different educational goals and processes with teaching towards a single test or hitting universal benchmarks? And how does a universal curriculum like the Common Core impact a pluralistic system? Okay, very good question. Let me just talk about the Common Core for a second. Common Core, first of all, there will not be, nor can there be legally, a federal curriculum in our country. It's just education belongs to the states. The Common Core curriculum was voted by legislatures for particular reasons. It wasn't a curriculum. It's very interesting. The Common Core was simply a set of skills and standards. And in math, the content and the standards are very much the same. But in English and in social studies and in sciences, but particularly the humanities, the process, the skills, the learning how to learn cannot be a substitute for really learning content. So that was just an aside. Whoever wrote that very good question, please write me offline and we can talk more about it, about Common Core. But the way it works in a system is, let's talk about the Netherlands. The Netherlands funds 36 different kinds of schools. The only school they won't fund is a Waldorf school, because the Waldorf will not allow their kids to take the assessments. Now, in contrast to the United States, the Netherlands has a knowledge-rich curriculum that they require all kids to learn. And that doesn't mean that they all have the same textbook. They have very different textbooks, but they have common learning goals. Now, at the different schools, that has to be the academic goal. They can get to it in different ways. They can use different pedagogies. They can also have their own curriculum. And in the Netherlands, let me give you the most extreme example. They fund creationist schools. They fund schools that teach a 6-day creation. However, because they have these tough curricular frameworks and assessments, every child who attends a creationist school has to demonstrate mastery of the evolutionary theory. So that's how they split that. You can teach certain things about the natural world, but you also have to teach the scientific method. And kids have to demonstrate competence on it. Another example would be, well, most OECD countries require comparative religion and ethics every year as a subject. So a universal curriculum where you're having to teach kids about what different people believe. If you go to a Jewish school, which reinforces your observance of Judaism, you still have to demonstrate competent knowledge of Hinduism, of Greek Orthodoxy, of Marxism, for example. This gets back to this issue of not confusing exposure with indoctrination. I don't know if that answers the question, but because they separate the ethos and the ethos and the pedagogical style, you could have very different pedagogical styles, but you still have to hit the same content. The United States has not had a content-rich approach to education since the early 20th century. We have focused on skills and process. That has been a separate disaster for low-income kids. Again, there's a lot of research about the importance of a content-specific curriculum. Our institute works on this every day. I would love to talk to any of you about this at another time. It's a very good question. How do we balance the ability to choose schools with making sure we don't create further cultural bubbles? Yes, and this person said, very exciting to think about this model. Thank you. So when you have a diverse population, there are two different ways to structure it. Education. You can go with the uniform model and force everyone into the same cultural mindset, as it were, or you can fund all different kinds of schools, which is the pluralistic model. Interestingly, the Netherlands had the same mix of immigrants that the United States did. Beginning of the 19th century, over time they became pluralistic, we became uniform. How do you prevent cultural bubbles? Two things to say about that. The way you prevent it is by having common assessments and content that every child needs. I just got off of a panel with the Ministry of Education in Alberta, Canada. They fund Inuit schools. They even fund homeschooling, Catholic schools, Jewish schools, all kinds of First Nation schools, and yet they all have to learn the same content alongside of their own traditions and their own vocabularies. That's the best way to avoid creating cultural bubbles. However, I want to point something else out. The state needs to get involved if it thinks there's something that's actually a deterrent to social cohesion. Social cohesion is very, very important. And so I'll give you an example. The Netherlands does fund Islamic schools. And they found a few years ago that some of the schools were using textbooks that were in Arabic that had been published in the Middle East and were anti-Western and anti-democracy. And this was not okay. That was a cultural bubble that was not okay. And so the Ministry of Education said, okay, all the textbooks have to be published in this country. And I think that's a fully appropriate thing. I do want to say that this is a really tough issue, that every school system struggles against creating cultural bubbles. Two things on that. Residential assignment creates cultural bubbles. If you can only go to school with the people who live in your neighborhood, you are, by definition, creating socioeconomic cultural bubbles, which are very important. Some of the most culturally integrated schools are the urban Catholic schools, at least in the research so far. But you also have to make sure that schools are inclusive on the inside. So it's very possible to have schools that in the aggregate look very diverse and every measure of diversity. But when you look under the hood, you find, as we've seen sometimes tragically, that children are separated by their racial background, their socioeconomic background. That is a huge thing that every policymaker at every level has to really be cognizant of. So again, avoid cultural bubbles by exposure to a wide variety and a similar content. How are funds distributed in a pluralistic system? It very much depends. Places like the Netherlands and the UK, because they're historically plural, have block grants where they will fund capital. The UK, when I was living there, experienced a huge growth in the Jewish school sector. The chief rabbi, Jonathan Sachs, made Jewish school attendance a huge priority, such that by the time he resigned his official title, 67% of the Jewish kids in the UK attended a Jewish day school at the state's expense. The way they did that was that government funded 85% of the capital costs of the schools, and then 100% of the operating costs. The Netherlands does a similar block transfer. Places like France, which is very secular, but still has a pluralistic system, they'll fund a lot of different kinds of schools. There's a sliding scale. The governance that the state's allowed in the school, there's a higher funding proportion. The teachers are all funded on their salaries as civil servant model. Places like Sweden and Poland that are more recently pluralistic have kind of per capita funding that can follow a child, to the school that he or she chooses. So the funds are distributed very differently, and those are the block grants, and the per capita calculations are the two most common. One more model, in Australia. Australia, like us, is a provincial or state system. The education's run at the provincial level, and yet the federal government in Australia has become the #1 funder of tuition at private schools because those schools were having such an outsized positive impact on first generation kids. And so they disperse the funds based on a formula about the enrollment of the existing schools. That's a very good question. Are there places in the US that demonstrate positive educational outcomes using a charter and school choice model in underserved communities such as Baltimore? Great question. So with the charter models, the most studied charters have been studied extensively, and while there is variability because the state laws govern how tough the charter is to obtain and so forth. Stanford University's Credo Center has done a lot of studies of the charters sector, and places, I'll tell you, Boston, Massachusetts has one of the best charter laws in the country. It's very hard to get a charter and the demands are great. The most positive educational outcomes, the achievement gaps in Boston in charter schools, particularly for children of color, the achievement gaps between well-off and impoverished kids in Boston is absolutely erased by the charter sector. That's how good the charters are. School choice models, Florida has the most school choice mechanisms. It is also the most studied. The outcomes that we've seen are better. Oh, well, it's interesting. Recent studies showed better college enrollment and completion rates. Also, David Figlio, who's the dean of the Northwestern School of Education, has found again and again that when there's a huge when there's a critical mass of choices, and it can be district choices and charters and private schools like Miami-Dade, huge percentage of the kids are making those kinds of choices. When it's so distributed and so diverse, when there are still standards, all kids are better off. And it's not always true, depends on the enabling laws. But yes, there are some models to look at. I would look at Florida, I'd look at Boston. New York City, the charter schools are unbelievably successful. Baltimore, interestingly, Maryland has what's considered the weakest charter law in the country because the districts are the charter authorizers. And that's seen as not the best practice because it sets the district competition against the charters up. It's very difficult. There are a couple other nuances, but actually there are some in Baltimore, the Boost scholarships, which is a voucher program, and it's a very small voucher program in Maryland. It's the governor has recently asked for it to be built in mandatory allocation of funds for low-income kids to attend schools, private schools. There are a lot of kids in Baltimore who use that mechanism. It's a very good question. There's a lot of research, and I need to say, no school system is perfect, and pluralism doesn't solve all the problems, but it does give more, it's more nimble, and it does give more play in the joints. There are a lot of ways that policies can go wrong, so to be really careful of that. How would trade schools fit into this equation, or magnet schools and arts high schools? Yeah, I mean, Trade schools are really important. I mean, here I look at the Swiss and German models where all kids have to have a really, really great education up till 8th grade that's similar, or 9th grade, and then they can diverge. And that's, pluralism does this as well. They're fully funded trade schools that are high quality, they go right into industry. Certainly trade schools could be a really important part of this equation. There's a very interesting model that's not off the ground yet in Illinois, but it could be, and it's very exciting. So Illinois, I'll just say one moment, in 2017, they had what I would call a grand bargain in the legislature, where for the first time, the legislature voted for a tax credit for low-income kids to attend private schools, and they changed the funding formula for district schools to really, really increase the amount of money going to district schools. That was, nobody loved it, but that's what a compromise is. It was a pretty much of a legislative compromise that seems to have held. There's some talk of getting using those of forming industry-based private high schools with that tax credit money that could be very, very provocative and successful. And all of the trade unions have signed up to support it. So if you're interested in what's going on in that arena, let me know and I'll send you information about it. Okay, next question. What about curriculums within a school that expose kids to multiple schools of thought? Is this something? Yeah, I mean, I think that exposing kids to multiple schools of thought is really important. Is that something that's being explored right now? So when our institute evaluates a social studies curriculum, we evaluate meticulously different commercial English and commercial social studies curricula. We've developed kind of a trademarked process for that. It's meticulous. We're the only ones in the country who do it. We look for multiple perspectives. We look for that in every single unit. And we are working on that. In broadly speaking, social studies, it's much more, that's the sort of the subject where this is most viable. Interestingly, Civics, which is something Sandra Day O'Connor started to provide civic games and content to kids to teach about American democracy. Civics has produced something called the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap. I was a senior advisor on this. I was honored to be with so many luminaries of the civics world, but part of their framework is multiple perspectives. Now, there's a limit to multiple perspectives, but that's what we should expect our teachers to be able to do. And yes, it's being explored right now, in part because contested issues are so rife across this country. There are just 2 places that I would call attention to that are doing this very well. The first is Miami-Dade, which their board policy says democratic deliberation requires structured debate and multiple perspectives. And our teachers are going to deliver this. And so they've set the standard that we're going to deliberate and debate about important issues. McDonough School in Baltimore, we've worked with them as well. They have an amazing policy that I think is exemplary on multiple perspectives and democratic deliberation. And we know from the political science that when students experience classroom debate, where they're not demeaning people, they're not slogan slinging, they have structured debate about important subjects in every class, whether it's English or science but most likely English and social studies. That has a long-term outsized positive impact on civil tolerance, which doesn't mean anything goes. It means it means holding a strong view and respecting someone else's view, even if you disagree. Now, again, our institute, I'm happy to say, we have designed a school culture survey that actually brings those civic formation questions into play. We've grabbed onto some international questions that are from the International Civics and Citizenship Education Survey. Back to the comparisons, most democracies test their schools for this. We don't. So our institute has brought that into our school culture survey. We're working with district schools, private schools, charter schools across the country. But yes, it's hugely important. That's the other area I work on all the time is civic formation and how do we make it happen? Next question, does a pluralist system require more funding for education? Does it mean that what we now think of as private schools will be free? How does this concept interact with local funding? Very good question. So actually, a lot of this, every single state analysis of the impact of school choice, for want of a better word, impact on the state budgets has been that it saved money for the state because the districts have a huge amount of overhead costs and there's some inefficiencies built into it. But as long as you're I think the real issue is that if you're going to create more equitable funding for different kinds of schools, you have to be careful with the current personnel and the current teachers who have contracts with the district and so forth. It would take us a long time. I mean, I don't believe that the district is ever going to be redundant. I think most pluralistic countries have. In the Netherlands, 30% of the kids still attend what we would call a district school where there's direct funding. But I do think it would have implications for how property tax is divvied up. Right now, educational funding, there are three sources of funding for district schools and for private choice mechanisms. It's the federal government, which funds the title programs, which means it's all for low-income kids wherever they go to school. Mostly goes to the district, but is meant to be shared with charters and choice. There's the state funding and there's a local funding. Local funding is driven by property taxes, which is very, I think, real problem for equity. And so the ideal would be to divide the funds up more equitably so that they're not just contingent upon property. But it's for sure the end goal of pluralism would be that private schools are able to be accessed by all kids. Now, every country has what's called a fully independent school. These are schools that are so expensive that they're outside of the state sector. And there are very few in places like the UK. Interestingly enough, in the UK, which I know the best, a lot of the fully independent schools have incredible scholarship stipends. It's sort of like Yale and Harvard, and thanks to Bloomberg, Hopkins, that undergraduates can attend no matter what their financial background is. So, but the detangling of all of those contracts and promissory notes that were made to districts are really, they would take time. I think we're almost at time, but this is another really good question. How would you ensure quality of homeschooling? Yes, I have I like the way Alberta does it. Alberta will give families a stipend for homeschooling, but the kids still have to take they have to demonstrate competence of the same curriculum. Now, our assessments in our country tend to be inadequate because they are in math, they're okay, but in English language arts, which is the other that really, really counts, they tend to be about process, find the main idea instead of about content. If we could shift that equation like most, strong high-performing systems do, then the homeschooling kids would have to demonstrate competence of the same information. We have as an institute evaluated some of the homeschooling curriculum, and there is real variability in the quality and the intellectual robustness of those materials. It's true of district schools, it's true of charter schools. I mean, there's a lot of variability out there with respect to curriculum. It's something that we need to have national conversations about, state level conversations about. I talk to almost every school sector that we engage with. We talk about the quality of the materials and the instruction. It's not just one sector that struggles with this. Okay. What are next steps towards making this idea a reality in the US? Are there already groups advocating for it that I can follow? Yes, be in touch with me. I will put you in touch with anybody in the, educational pluralism is being advocated. I can send you some things about it that have been in the press. There are some grassroots organizations that are working for it. It's very state contingent. Please be in touch with me. It's ashley.berner@jhu.edu. And I see a note that we're at time. Thank you so much for your attention. It's been a real pleasure to be with you all. And thank you again to Hopkins at Home for the opportunity.